ND filters on action cameras are a double-edged sword. They can make your footage look cinematic, or completely ruin it. I learned this the hard way with my Osmo Action 5 Pro. My first attempts gave me nasty jitters and motion smearing, a classic pitfall when mixing slow shutter speeds with electronic image stabilization. The good news is there are ways to work around this, and with some tweaking, I was pretty happy with the results I was getting. So since these Action 5 filters are no longer compatible, for my new Osmo Action 6, I bought this K&F Nano X filter set. It comes with 4 ND filters, plus a CPL and a black diffusion filter. And now that I've had the chance to test them all out, in this video I'll show you how to use ND filters with the Osmo Action 6, various ways you can avoid or minimize EIS artifacts, how these K&F ND filters compare against other options on the market, and most importantly, who they actually make sense for, because depending on how you shoot, ND filters might not be worth all the hassle. And at the end, I'll also share my thoughts on the black diffusion filter that came in the pack, something I've never tried on an action camera before. So let's start with why you'd want ND filters on your Osmo Action 6 in the first place, and that comes down to motion blur. Motion blur is created by slowing down your camera's shutter speed. The problem is that doing this also exposes the sensor to light for longer, which in bright conditions means overexposed footage. ND filters solve this by acting like sunglasses for your camera. They reduce the amount of light hitting the sensor, allowing you to use slower shutter speeds and get natural looking motion blur without blowing out the image. To use them, you simply screw off the stock lens cover and screw on one of the 4 ND filters. You want to choose an ND strength that gives you an EV value of between around -0.7 to 0, while ideally keeping the ISO in the 100 to 800 range, and preferably not above 1600 at your chosen shutter speed. As for what shutter speed, a common rule of thumb is the 180-degree shutter rule, which means 1/60 for 30 fps or 1/50 at 24 fps. So far, so good, but let's be honest, most of us didn't buy an action camera to film stationary shots. Let's take another example. Here's some footage from my Action 6 that was mounted to the front of my bike. No ND filter and shot with full auto settings. Everything looks smooth and stable, exactly what you'd expect. Now let's pop the same ND filter back on and lock the shutter to 1/60 to get that natural motion blur. And as you can see, the footage we end up is borderline unusable with nasty jittering. This isn't a defect in the K&F filters, but a result of electronic image stabilization trying to correct camera shake in footage that has motion blur from a slow shutter speed. You've probably seen this same effect if you've ever filmed with an action camera at night. The camera slows the shutter to let in more light, often leaving you with similar artifacts. So what can we do about it? Well, there are 3 main strategies we can use, and you might even use a combination of them. The first option is to physically reduce how much the camera shakes in the first place. For example, stick to smoother roads where the amount of camera shake is less than on a rougher or bumpy road. Body mounting your camera and using your body as a natural shock absorber can also help by dampening those high-frequency vibrations. In general, smoother activities naturally produce fewer artifacts. Activities like walking are much harder to deal with because every footstep introduces a sharp impact that can cause noticeable jitter. The second option, and probably the most common approach to fixing EIS jitters, is simply not slowing the shutter down as much. Instead of strictly following the 180-degree shutter rule and locking in 1/60 of a second, you can use a more conservative shutter speed. For example, you might choose 1/120 for cycling footage, or 1/160 for those trickier walking shots. Of course, you won't get as much motion blur, but you'll still get some, and in return, you'll significantly reduce the severity of jitter and smearing artifacts. The third option, and the option I personally use most often, is to just disable in-camera stabilization entirely and then stabilize in post using gyroflow. With gyroflow, you can apply a lower amount of stabilization, meaning you can get footage with less noticeable artifacting at the cost of being a bit shakier. I find this works well for biking footage where the unstabilized source footage isn't too shaky to begin with. but not so well for walking shots where applying a conservative amount of stabilization isn't really enough to compensate for the intense vibrations introduced by each step. And if you're directly mounting your camera to your vehicle, you might even prefer the results without any stabilization, as the shake can give your footage a more immersive and raw feel. So who are these ND filters for then? In my experience, they make the most sense if you're shooting mostly static or slow-moving shots where the camera itself is relatively steady. They're also useful if you use your Osmo Action 6 for taking photos or time-lapses, or if you're recording in more stable, predictable scenarios like riding on smooth roads. Where I don't think they work well is walking footage with stabilization enabled. Footsteps introduce a lot of sudden, vertical movement, which is exactly where jitter and smearing become most obvious. And while you can push the shutter speed higher, to say 1/160, to reduce those artifacts, then the motion blur becomes so subtle that it's hard to justify all the extra hassle. So if, after all of that, you've decided ND filters do make sense for how you shoot, the next question is, which ones should you actually buy for your Osmo Action 6? And there are plenty of options out there. You've got the expensive official DJI ND filters and a range of third-party options from brands like Telesin, K&F, Freewell, and SmallRig. Now, I haven't gone out and tested every brand on the market, but these K&F filters performed very well in my testing. Color accuracy was great up to ND32 with fairly minimal color casting. ND64 did introduce a slightly more noticeable cast, but nothing severe, and certainly nothing that would be a deal breaker. I'd imagine that most reputable brands are similarly clean these days. The main thing I'd recommend is sticking to plain ND filters and avoid variable ND filters or combined ND-PL filters if you're worried about color shifts. One thing to be aware of is that there are two types of ND filters when it comes to mounting. These K&F filters are screw-on type. That means you'll need to remove the stock lens cover and screw the ND filter on each time. You can also get snap-on style ND filters, which is what I used on my Osmo Action 5 Pro. They're much quicker to swap in the field, but because you're effectively stacking glass, there may be some optical trade-offs. As for what ND ratings you need, I've gotten away with only needing the ND16 and ND32 so far. That said, having the ND8 and ND64 in the kit as well should cover the vast majority of shooting conditions you're likely to run into. Now, in addition to the ND filters, this kit also includes a black diffusion filter, which I was curious to try out. Black diffusion and black mist filters are supposed to soften the image and add bloom to highlights. In a lot of scenes though, the effect was very subtle, to the point where it was really hard to tell whether the filter was even on or off. That said, in certain situations, the difference was definitely noticeable. In this scene with bright neon lights, you can see extra glow around the signs, and the entire image takes on a subtle, fog-like softness. In selfie footage under harsh sunlight, my skin tones also looked slightly softer with the black diffusion filter on. Personally though, I think I'll mostly stick to shooting without it. A black diffusion filter begs to look directly into your footage, and for my use case, I prefer to keep things clean and just add a similar diffusion effect in post if I really need it. So overall, ND filters are an essential accessory if you want true motion blur in bright conditions. Just keep in mind that they are situational and they do require a bit of effort and experimentation on your part to get things looking right. In this video, I focused mainly on using ND filters for video, but they're also very useful if you're taking photos with your Osmo Action 6 or if you want to introduce motion blur into time lapses as well.